After years of giving, my parents still ignored me and favored the golden child financially. I did this to traumatize them back. I'm a 33-year-old guy, and I've spent most of my adult life trying to help my parents out of financial struggles. Growing up, we weren't exactly poor, but we were far from comfortable. My parents worked hard, but couldn't seem to catch a break when it came to money. Bills piled up, debts accumulated, and they barely scraped by. Watching them struggle was tough. So when I started earning good money, I made it my mission to help them. Over the years, I did everything I could to ease their burden. I paid off their mortgage after a health scare, left them unable to keep up with payments. I set up a retirement fund for them, so they wouldn't have to worry about their later years. When their car broke down, I bought them a reliable one. And when they said they needed a new roof over their heads, I even helped them buy a modest house. All of this wasn't easy for me, but I did it out of love. I wanted to see them comfortable after everything they've been through. Then there's my younger sister who's 29. She's always been the golden child. You know the type. One who can do no wrong in their parents' eyes. Growing up, she got away with things that would have gotten me grounded for a month even. Now, she's been bailed out of countless financial messes by our parents. Overdraft fees paid, credit card debt covered. She's had jobs, but she's also blown through money like it grows on trees. My parents always brushed it off, saying she just needs a little help. Meanwhile, I've been the one stepping up whenever there's a real crisis. Last week we had a family dinner. It was supposed to be a casual thing, just catching up and spending time together. My sister was there, of course, flaunting some new designer handbags she bought. She's always got something shiny and expensive to show off, even though she's constantly asking for financial help. I kept my mouth shut though. I didn't want to ruin the evening. At one point I went to the kitchen to grab a drink, and I overheard my parents talking in hushed voices. They were discussing their will. Normally I wouldn't eavesdrop, but something about the tone caught my attention. What I heard stopped me cold. They're planning to leave everything to my sister. The house, the retirement savings, everything. My mom said something like she'll need it more than him. He's doing fine on his own. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After all the sacrifices I've made, all the money I've poured into their well-being, they're leaving me with nothing. Felt like a punch to the gut. I didn't confront them right then and there. Honestly, I was too stunned to say anything. Instead, I went back to the table and tried to act normal, though I could barely focus on the conversation. My sister, oblivious as always, was going on about some extravagant vacation she's planning. She's got no savings, no steady income, but she's booking luxury trips like it's no big deal. I couldn't help but feel the weight of everything I'd done for our parents, compared to her carefree lifestyle. It didn't seem fair. After dinner, I vented to my best friend about what I'd overheard. He was just as shocked as I was. His advice was to confront my parents directly, but I wasn't sure. Part of me wanted to believe there was some misunderstanding, that maybe I'd heard them wrong, but deep down I knew I hadn't. A few days later I asked my parents if we could talk. I brought up the topic of their will, and tried to stay calm as I asked about their plans. They didn't deny it. Instead they doubled down, saying my sister needs the inheritance more, because she's not financially stable. They said, I should be proud that I don't need their help, and that I've always been the responsible one. Hearing that hurt more than I expected. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the principle. I spent years putting them first, sacrificing my own goals and savings, to make sure they were okay. And now, it felt like they were taking all of that for granted. My sister, who's never had to step up or take responsibility for anything, is being rewarded for it. The conversation ended with me feeling more lost than ever. My parents seemed oblivious to how their decision affected me. And my sister, she walked in halfway through the talk and laughed it off, saying it's not like you need it anyway. I don't know what to do. Part of me wants to cut ties and let them deal with the consequences of their choices. Another part of me thinks I should fight for what's fair. But would that make me just as bad as my sister? I've been turning this over in my head for days, and I still don't have an answer. So here I am writing this out and wondering, am I overreacting? Or do I have a right to feel betrayed? Update 1. After a few sleepless nights turning things over in my head, I decided I couldn't just let this go. Ignoring it wasn't an option anymore. It wasn't about needing their money. It was about fairness. After years of sacrifices, I couldn't just sit back and watch them hand everything to my sister without even a conversation. I reached out to my parents and suggested another family dinner. I kept the tone casual, and they agreed without hesitation. My sister, predictably, was thrilled at the idea of another dinner she could turn into her personal showcase. This time, though, I had a plan. I rehearsed exactly what I wanted to say, and made a promise to myself to stay calm, no matter how things unfolded. When the evening rolled around, everything started out normal. My parents had made their usual spread of home cooked dishes, and my sister showed up fashionably late. As always, carrying a shopping bag from some high-end store. She barely greeted anyone before launching into a monologue about the new phone she just bought. It was the Pro model, top of the line. And she went on about the features as if she designed it herself. My parents listened, with the kind of attention they reserved only for her, nodding along and throwing in compliments about how tech-savvy she was. I let her chatter for a bit before I brought up the reason I'd arranged the dinner. I started by casually mentioning some financial planning I'd been doing recently, steering the conversation toward wills and estates. My parents looked uneasy, but I pressed on, asking if they'd given any more thought to how they'd handle their assets in the future. That's when the deflection started. My mom suddenly remembered the dessert in the oven and rushed to the kitchen. My dad leaned back in his chair and muttered something vague about not wanting to think about those things right now. My sister, on the other hand, seemed amused. She leaned forward, smirking as if she knew exactly where this was going. I didn't let the topic drop. I pointed out that it was important to have these discussions, especially given the financial help I provided over the years. My parents exchanged a glance, and my dad finally admitted they'd made some decisions. He tried to soften it by saying they were proud of how self-sufficient I was, and that they'd always known I'd be okay on my own. Hearing it spelled out like that hit me like a brick. My sister, of course, couldn't resist chiming in. She laughed and said something about how I was overthinking it, that I didn't need to worry since I had more than enough already. Her tone was dripping with entitlement, like she truly believed she deserved. What hurt me the most was the scene. She shrugged and said my contributions were voluntary, so I shouldn't expect anything in return. Then she even joked about how I must have been keeping score all these years, as if that was the only reason I'd helped in the first place. My parents were silent. From the look on their faces, I could tell they totally agreed with her, like they were blaming me for causing all this trouble. I was emotionally drained. I stood up, told them I needed some time to process, and walked out. Now I'm here wondering what my next move should be. Do I go no contact? Do I fight for what's right? Or do I just let it go and focus on building my own life? Right now, I don't have the answers, but one thing's for sure. This isn't over. Update 2. After that explosive family dinner, I needed some clarity. Walking away had felt like the right move at the time, but the questions kept piling up. Why were my parents so adamant about leaving everything to my sister? How much of their financial situation did I really understand, and most importantly, was there more going on behind the scenes? The first step was to take a closer look at their finances. I had helped them set up their retirement fund a few years back, so I reached out to the financial advisor who handled the paperwork. Since I was listed as the initial contributor, I still had access to the account information. The advisor didn't hesitate to send over the recent statements. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but it wasn't this. Over the past year, there had been multiple large withdrawals from the account. I'm talking about amounts that didn't match their usual expenses, not even close. My parents live a modest lifestyle. Their bills are predictable: utilities, groceries, and an occasional dinner out. These withdrawals were far above what they'd need for any of that. I cross-referenced the dates with what I knew about my sister's emergencies. It all lined up. There was a $5,000 withdrawal around the time she mentioned her car needed unexpected repairs. A few months later, there was another withdrawal for $3,000, which happened to coincide with her buying that designer handbag she showed off at dinner. The biggest one, though, was a whopping $15,000 withdrawal last summer, right when she'd gone on a life-changing international vacation. I decided to confront my parents about it. When I brought it up, they brushed me off. My mom waved her hand and said they could spend their money however they wanted. My dad added that they were just helping out when my sister needed it. They acted like this was normal, as if draining the account I'd built their retirement was no big deal. I reminded them that this was money I'd set aside for their future, not her lifestyle. They didn't want to hear it. My mom got defensive, saying they didn't want my sister to feel like they weren't there for her. My dad tried to end the conversation by claiming it wasn't my business how they handled their finances. At that point, I knew I needed professional advice. I reached out to a lawyer who specializes in financial disputes to explain the situation. The lawyer was straightforward. If I could prove that my contributions were meant for specific purposes, like their mortgage or retirement, I might have a case to reclaim some of the money. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was enough to give me hope. Meanwhile, my sis sent me a string of sarcastic texts. One of them stood out. Why are you so obsessed with what mom and dad do with their money? She even posted a cryptic message on social media about toxic people who think money equals love. It didn't take long for mutual friends and family to connect the dots. This crazy woman doesn't even know that karma's coming for her. I dug up old bank statements, receipts and even emails where my parents had explicitly thanked me for specific contributions. There was one in particular. From when I paid off their mortgage. My mom had, "You're saving us from losing the house. We don't know how to thank you enough." That email alone felt like a lifeline. It proved that my help wasn't just casual. It was critical to their stability. Now it's my turn to traumatize them back. Update 3. A few days later, my mom called, casually asking if I could help with some upcoming house repairs. I repeated my stance. No financial support until the inheritance plans were adjusted. She went quiet, then said she'd talk to my dad about it. I didn't hear back from either of them after that. Meanwhile, my sister decided to escalate things in the most dramatic way possible. Word started getting around to our extended family that I was demanding money from my parents and threatening to sue them. Of course, she left out all the details about the financial contributions I'd made over the years or the fact that she was the one draining their retirement fund. Instead, she painted herself as the dutiful daughter, just trying to protect her aging parents from their greedy son. The fallout was immediate. Relatives I hadn't spoken to in months suddenly started reaching out. Some were genuinely curious about what was going on, while others were outright accusatory. One aunt called to tell me I was being ungrateful, and that parents don't owe their children anything. Another cousin sent me a long text about how family should come before money. It was frustrating, but I kept my responses short and stuck to the facts. I wasn't going to get into a war of words over half-truths and rumors. Thankfully, not everyone bought into my sister's narrative. One of my cousins, who I've always been close to, reached out to share some surprising insights. Apparently, my sister had been running the same manipulative playbook for years. My cousin recounted how my sister had once guilt their parents into signing a loan for her, only to default on it and leave them holding the bag. Another relative had loaned her money for a business idea that never materialized. The pattern was obvious. She took, leaving others to clean up the mess. Armed with more context, I doubled down on gathering my own evidence. I went through every receipt, bank statement and email I could find, compiling a detailed timeline of my contributions. My lawyer reviewed everything and confirmed I had a strong case, especially since many of the payments had specific purposes attached to them, like the mortgage payoff and retirement fund deposits. It wasn't just generosity, it was an investment in my parents' stability. Then came the next bombshell. While organizing my documents, I stumbled across some text messages my sister had sent to my parents. They were filled with the kind of manipulative language that made my blood boil. In one, she guilted them by saying she was tired of feeling like the black sheep and deserved to be taken care of for once. In another, she outright asked them to keep her as the sole beneficiary, claiming it was the only way to make things right. The messages made it clear that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. She was actively working to undermine me. I confronted my parents with the text, hoping it would finally make them see the bigger picture. Instead, they doubled down on their stance. My mom admitted they'd been leaning on my sister more for emotional support lately, especially after our recent conflicts. My dad added that they felt obligated to help her get back on her feet. When I pointed out that enabling her behavior wasn't the same as helping her, they just looked uncomfortable and changed the subject. The stress from all of this started bleeding into other areas of my life. My work performance took a hit as I struggled to focus, and I found myself snapping at friends over minor things. One of my closest friends finally sat me down and gave me some much-needed perspective. She reminded me that boundaries are about protecting yourself, not punishing others, and that I needed to stick to mine if I ever wanted peace. So I drew a line in the sand. I told my parents in no uncertain terms that they needed to make things right. If they didn't, I was prepared to take legal action to reclaim what I'd contributed. I also let them know that my relationship with them and my sister wouldn't survive if they continued down this path. It was harsh, but it was the truth. The next day, my sister took to social media again, this time posting a long, cryptic rant about entitled people who think money equals love. It was obvious who she was talking about, and her friends and followers rushed to her defense, showering her with sympathy. I didn't respond. Let her have her moment. I had bigger things to focus on. Now I'm at a critical point. My lawyer is ready to file the necessary paperwork, but taking this step feels like crossing a bridge I never go back over. Update 4. I wasn't planning on going to the family event. After everything that had happened, being in the same room as my parents and sister felt like a terrible idea. But when my dad called and practically begged me to attend, I gave in. He said it was just a casual dinner with some relatives, and that it would mean a lot if I showed up. Reluctantly, I agreed, figuring I could make a quick appearance and leave early. When I arrived, the atmosphere was tense but polite. My parents greeted me warmly enough, but there was an undercurrent of unease. My sister was already there, chatting with some relatives holding court. As usual, she didn't even glance in my direction when I walked in. I decided to keep my distance and focus on catching up with some of the extended family I hadn't seen in a while. Things were fine for a while. People made small talk, laughed, and shared stories. I was starting to think, maybe I could get through the evening without any drama. That hope was shattered when my sister decided to make her move. It started with a casual remark, something about how some people can't handle not being the center of attention. She didn't mention me by name, but it was obvious who she was talking about. A few people chuckled awkwardly, unsure of whether she was joking. I ignored it, hoping she'd drop it and move on. She didn't. A few minutes later, she made another job, this time about how family money shouldn't come with strings attached. Again, it was vague, but everyone knew the context. I could feel the room shift as people started whispering and glancing in my direction. At that point, I couldn't stay silent anymore. I stood up and addressed the room, explaining exactly what had been going on. I told them about the financial contributions I'd made over the years. I made it clear that I wasn't asking for anything unreasonable, just fairness. The room went quiet. My sister's smug smile disappeared, replaced by an expression of feigned innocence. She countered by accusing me of trying to control our parents and acting entitled. She brought up the fact that I'm financially stable and don't need anything from them. The argument escalated quickly, with her raising her voice and interrupting me at every turn. My parents tried to mediate, but their attempts only made things worse. Instead of addressing the actual issue, they defended my sister, saying she'd been going through a lot, and they were just trying to help her. Hearing that was the final straw for me. I couldn't believe how blind they were to her manipulations. Or maybe they just didn't want to see it. I told them I was done trying to reason with them, done being the scapegoat, done pretending this was anything other than blatant favoritism. Then I grabbed my coat and walked out. I didn't wait to hear their responses or see the fallout. I just needed to get out of there. The next morning, my parents called me multiple times. I ignored the first few, but eventually I picked up. They sounded desperate, begging me to reconsider my stance. They claimed they never meant to hurt me, and that they just wanted to keep the family together. I told them it was too late for that. Actions have consequences and they needed to face theirs. That same day, I finalized my decision to pursue legal action. I submitted all my documentation, emails, receipts, bank statements, everything. The ball was officially rolling. As the days passed, the fallout continued. My sister ramped up her passive-aggressive texts, accusing me of tearing the family apart and making my parents' lives harder. I stopped responding altogether. It was clear there was no reasoning with her. Meanwhile, some relatives started pressuring my parents to make amends. Apparently, my walkout at the dinner had sparked conversations, and not everyone was buying my sister's narrative. A few even reached out to me privately, offering support and sharing their own stories of how my sister had taken advantage of them. Update 5. The legal process started with a simple filing, but it felt like the beginning of something much larger. My lawyer submitted the claim, listing every financial contribution I'd made toward my parents' mortgage, retirement fund, and other expenses. It was clear, factual, and backed by documentation. There was no room for ambiguity. The fallout at home was immediate. My parents were furious, calling to accuse me of tearing the family apart. My sister, unsurprisingly, jumped in with her usual dramatics. She told anyone who would listen that I was suing my own parents out of greed. Extended family members started picking sides. Some reached out to offer support, saying they understood where I was coming from. Others were harsher, telling me to drop the case and think about what this is doing to your mom and dad. The division was exhausting, but I stuck to my decision. It wasn't about punishing anyone. It was about fairness. My lawyer suggested offering a settlement to avoid a drawn-out court case. We proposed a repayment plan that would cover a portion of the retirement fund I contributed, but my parents rejected it outright. Instead, they offered a much smaller amount, barely enough to cover a fraction of what I'd put in. I declined. A court date was set, and the tension only grew from there on. The day of the hearing, I walked into the courtroom, feeling a mix of nerves and resolve. My parents and sister were already there, sitting together on one side of the room. They didn't acknowledge me when I entered, which honestly made things easier. The proceedings started with my lawyer laying out the case. The judge listened carefully, asking a few questions to clarify the intent behind my contributions. My lawyer emphasized that these were not casual gifts, but deliberate financial support, meant to secure my parents' future. When it was my sister's turn to speak, she went full victim mode. She claimed I was vindictive and controlling, accusing me of trying to dictate how my parents lived their lives. She painted herself as someone who had always struggled financially and relied on our parents for basic support. Theatrics were impressive, But they didn't hold up under scrutiny. The evidence was too strong, and her arguments were riddled with inconsistencies. My parents didn't help their case much either. They admitted that most of the money had gone to my sister. They tried to justify it by saying they were just trying to help. But it became clear they hadn't considered the long-term consequences. The judge didn't look impressed. After a tense back and forth, the ruling came down in my favor. The court ordered my parents to repay a significant portion of the funds I'd contributed. It wasn't the full amount, but it was enough to validate everything I'd been fighting for. My sister's reaction was predictably over the top. She stormed out of the courtroom. Blaming my parents for dragging her into this mess was a stark contrast to the confidence she'd exuded earlier. In the weeks that followed, the fallout continued. My parents, now facing financial strain, were forced to make some tough decisions. They downsized their home to free up money for the repayment and began cutting back on expenses. It was a harsh reality check, but one they needed. My sister, on the other hand, didn't seem to learn anything. She continued her reckless spending, burning through what little resources she had left. Eventually she hit a financial wall, and the same relatives who had defended her started distancing themselves. As for me, the victory was bittersweet. The legal battle had taken an emotional toll, and my relationship with my family was more fractured than ever. My parents expressed regret, reaching out to apologize for how they'd handled things. While I appreciated the sentiment, I couldn't ignore how deeply their actions had hurt me. I decided to keep my distance for now, focusing on rebuilding my life. Without the weight of their expectations, I threw myself into my career, channeling the energy I'd spent on my family drama into something productive. Slowly but surely I started to feel a sense of peace. It wasn't easy standing up to my family, but it was necessary. I've learned that fairness isn't always something people will offer willingly. You have to fight for it. And sometimes, walking away from toxic dynamics is the only way to find peace. Comment from Read Best. Want to know the secret to raising a kid who's filial? Easy, just ignore them from a young age. Big hugs to OP, big hugs to myself, and hey, one for you too. It's time to start reparenting yourself.